Hello and welcome to our program this evening. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. I'm looking forward to our program tonight with three women who have published three powerful books about the people who moved back to the towns and cities where their families were forced out of during the Holocaust, or who went back themselves to those cities and towns. The three publishers of these books, writers of these books, are Mimi Schwartz, Cathryn Bergman, and Ellen Cassedy, and you see their three dust jackets in the screen there. Before we get to their works, however, I do want to take a diversion and just put in a plug for some of our other online programs that are coming up. So next Tuesday, I will be interviewing Rebecca Frankel about her newest book, which recounts an amazing tale of perseverance, bravery, and love as it follows one particular family as they escaped from the Nazis and eventually settled in the United States. Next Wednesday, I'll be back with my next Curator's Corner, my short, about 20 or 30-minute programs where I look at one particular object or image in our museum. And next Wednesday, I'm going to be talking about a yellow star that we have that the Nazis famously or infamously used as a symbol of discrimination, dehumanization, and hate. And one more program to mention, on Tuesday, November 9th, we will be holding a program to remember the so-called Kristallnacht pogrom that took place 83 years ago, focusing in particular on acts of resistance as described by Jeffrey Sussman, another speaker who'll be joining us. So you can find details about these programs and our full schedule on our website at www.hmtcli.org, and then click on the events tab. Okay, enough advertisements. Let me stop sharing my screen and instead introduce our speakers tonight, each of whom is going to speak for about 10 minutes and share some information and background about their work. And then we will open the floor to discussion and questions. So the first to speak will be Cathryn Siegal-Bergman, who is the translator and publisher of Going Back: 16 Jewish Women Tell Their Life Stories and Why They Tell Their Life Stories and Why They Returned to Germany, the country that once wanted to kill them. Cathryn is a resident of Cleveland, Ohio, joining us from Cleveland, Ohio. She earned her bachelor's in philosophy and German from Cleveland State University, and then a master's in translation from the Institute for Applied Linguistics at Kent State University. She worked as a freelance translator, including for several publishers, before starting Clevo Books, an independent publishing house that published this work, and that focuses particularly on projects that explore cultural identity. So Cathryn will join us in just a minute. I want to introduce our other speakers as well at this point. Our second speaker will be Mimi Schwartz, a professor emeritus in writing at Stockton University, who will be speaking about her most recent book, Good Neighbors, Bad Times Revisited. Mimi is the author of 5 books and numerous shorter pieces. She's received a number of honors, including being named a Geraldine R. Dodge Fellow and a McDowell Fellow. And she has, thanks to her 4 other books, been recognized with a range of awards, including the New Hampshire Outstanding Literary Nonfiction Award. And actually, her newest book, The Good Neighbors, Bad Times Revisited, was recently listed in the 10 not to be missed books of 2021 by the literary magazine Ninth Letter. And our third speaker will be Ellen Cassedy, an award-winning Yiddish translator and a former columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News, who has written 2 books, including the one she'll be talking about this evening, We Are Here, Memories of the Lithuanian Holocaust. We Are Here, as you will hear, recounts her return to Lithuania to connect to her Jewish family roots, but expands to look more broadly at how Lithuanians today, both Jews and non-Jews, are dealing with their history under Nazi and Soviet rule. The book has won a number of prizes, including the Grub Street National Book Prize for Nonfiction, the Towson Prize for Literature, and the Best Book Prize from the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. So as I said, each of these 3 speakers is going to give a short introduction about their book. I believe they are also going to share a short excerpt from their book, and we'll then move to a discussion about some of the themes that link their three works. So if you have any questions that come up during the presentations, please use the Q&A window of Zoom, type in your question, and I will make sure to pose it to one of our panelists or all three. So with those long-winded words of introduction, I apologize, and the layout for our plan, I'm delighted to welcome Cathryn Siegal-Bergman to lead off our program. Catherine, can I get you back up here?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for putting this event together. I appreciate it very much. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I studied German in college and lived in southern Germany for a little more than a year. And I grew up in the Jewish community in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, where my grandparents were very active, Alvin and Laura Siegel. And so when I had an opportunity to translate this book, I thought it was going to be a really great way to give back to the community that I was raised in, and to my grandparents especially, because they were the ones who made it possible for me to pursue this line of work. I wanted to begin with this, with an excerpt from the chapter that tells the story of Steffi Wittenberg. And as you'll hear, many Germans came to the United States. One of the things as a Jew growing up in Cleveland Heights, the oral history of the Holocaust in my family and in my smaller community never ever talked about going back. Whenever I asked a Holocaust survivor if they ever thought about, when I was a child, of course, if they ever thought about going back, they all just kind of dismissed me and said, no, never. But I never knew that people did go back. And so this book was a real eye-opener for me. And we'll begin with Steffi Wittenberg. We arrived in Montevideo on the 28th of January, 1940. I had just turned 14, so I went to school briefly and learned Spanish there, more or less. I later took private lessons and went to a trade school where I learned stenography and typing, along with English and Spanish. With that training, I worked as a foreign language secretary until retirement. My husband, Kurt, was born in 1920. I met him in the anti-fascist committee where he was very active. His family had lived in Osterode, East Prussia. The Germans persecuted Jews there too. They led his father around the city with a sign that said, "I, Jew, may not hit any German boys," after those boys stuck posters up in his leather shop with "Jew slave" on them. Then they locked him up. He was freed again, but had to report to the police station 3 times a day. After that, the family decided to emigrate. Kurt had to interrupt his studies to train as a mason in Breslau because he thought you could lay bricks everywhere. He also experienced Kristallnacht in Breslau. He lived with a widow there, and the Gestapo came and arrested her older son on the 9th of November. They could have taken Kurt as well. He was actually 18 then. But he slept in the maid's room and they didn't look there. The son was released and went to Uruguay with his brother. They never got their mother out. She was murdered. My husband arrived in Montevideo with his parents at the end of 1938. His sister had already been sent with a Kindertransport to Atlanta, Georgia in 1937. After the war, her parents wanted to see her again. All 3 of them went to Houston, Texas, because a relative had a meat processing factory there. My husband and his father worked there as security guards at night. For the first several days, Kurt was excited by all the modernity, but he quickly picked up on the fact that there was great discrimination against the Black population, that everything was separate, the neighborhoods, the schools, the movie theaters. For someone who came from Nazi Germany and remembered how the Jews were alienated, Of course, it came as a great shock to him. In Uruguay, Kurt was embedded in the union of the emigrated youth. In America, he felt lonely and unhappy. He wrote asking if I would like to come. After discussing it with my parents and friends, I went to Houston in January 1948. A month later, we were married. I got a job and supported my husband, who was politically engaged with the Civil Rights Congress and the NAACP, and also in the Communist Party. It was tiny, but it existed. He was especially dedicated to fighting racism there. I jumped into that fight as well. I was as much an advocate as he was. Of course, we also talked about our German pasts. When the workers in the meat processing factory where my husband worked wanted to start a workers' union, the boss was against it, so they went on strike. My husband had a choice, stand with his cousin, the boss, or go on strike with his work colleagues. He chose the latter. As a result, the cousin reported us to the immigration authorities as communists. The Communist Party was not illegal, in fact, but they were accused of campaigning to overthrow the government. We were ordered to appear before the authorities and make a statement about ourselves and what our political activity looked like. We refused. The questioning stopped, but then there was a file with our names on it, Kurt and Steffi Wittenberg. And it was publicized in the press that there was a lawsuit against us in which they accused us of participating in taking down the government. It became increasingly harder for us. Kurt had lost his job and worked for a demolition company. I was also let go and worked in the office at a shoe store. The Korean War started in 1950, and one day a colleague slapped me and yelled, "You damn communist! Our boys are fighting against the communists, and you are a communist." It was the McCarthy era, a time when the anti-communist hysteria broke out. There was the House Committee on Un-American Activities, in which there was always only one important question at those terrible hearings. Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Because we made less money, I had lost my job again. We had to sublet. None of our friends or neighbors harassed us, but the majority of German Jews who themselves had experienced racial discrimination didn't understand our fight. Second-generation East European Jews, however, supported us and collected money so that we could go to Europe. Because more and more, we were ready to leave the country. We tried to get permits to travel to East Germany. In 1950 or 1951, we wrote the government there. We would very much like to participate in building a socialist Germany. The answer was, very nice. But if we wanted to participate in building a peaceful Germany, then we should go to West Germany. From their point of view, within East Germany, they were afraid that someone was a spy from the West, and rightly so if they came from America. But we really did want to build a different Germany. After we had signed away our right to return to the USA in May 1951, we drove from Houston to New Orleans, accompanied by an immigration officer. He escorted us onto the ship and gave the captain our passports. Getting them was not easy. All immigrants, whether politically persecuted or Jewish refugees, were stripped of citizenship from Nazi Germany. It was now the Federal Republic of Germany. Our citizenship was not automatically reinstated. Instead, we had to put in a request for naturalization documents. We sent them to the German consulate in New York and then received our passports. In Hamburg, we were met by a man from German immigration with the words, "Hello, Herr und Frau Wittenberg, welcome to Germany."
Thanks so much for that teaser. And that really just does give us, I mean, it's a taste of the book, but there's much more to talk about, as I hope everybody realizes. And I know it's raised for me a couple of things that I want to bring up, but before we do that, I do want to get Mimi next to share about her book, Good Neighbors, Bad Times Revisited. And so we'll come back to you definitely with a bunch of questions, Catherine. Thanks so much for giving us that initial warm up, though.
Great.
Here I am.
Super.
Well, I am delighted to be here today and on a panel with two other authors who, like myself, decided to re-enter history to gather and interpret and translate the small stories of 1930s Europe and why they matter, what ordinary people did, especially in our polarized world of today. My focus was on a little German village called Rexingen, where my father was born in 1898, a generation before Hitler. It's about 60 kilometers south of Stuttgart, and in my father's day, half of the village was Jewish, the other half Catholic, with maybe 3 or 4 Protestant families, and the total population was 1,200 people. Let's see, there it is. And as my father used to tell me as I was growing up in Queens, New York, in Rexingen, we all got along. I tune out, especially when he added, in Rexingen, children knew how to behave, or later in Rexingen, girls didn't wear lipstick. His world was not mine, I thought, being the first American born in my family 3 years after they fled Germany. I wanted to be 100% American and past free. 40 years later, this Torah changed my mind about legacy and connection. It was in the memorial room on a wall in a moshav in Israel that was founded by a group from the village of Rexingen who came to Israel at about the time my parents came to the United States. And the old man who took me around told me how it had been rescued on Kristallnacht, not by the Jews, but by their Christian neighbors. Now, I'd grown up on 1950s Nazi movies, and Germans in those narratives were not rescuing anything Jewish back then. So this took me by surprise. And after all, my father's good memories of getting along in Rexingen took place 40 years before Hitler. So this rescue, however, was during the Nazi times. And so I began a quest to understand who saved it and why. First, by interviewing dozens of village Jews who fled and settled elsewhere, and then their former neighbors still in the village, who the Jews remembered as doing what they could to help. I wasn't interested in the Nazis. There was plenty of written about that. I was interested in what decency meant in those days when the pressure of the politics of hate was so strong. What did it mean to neighbors? And then there was the issue, were the memories of these Jews nostalgia or were they true? I didn't know. And in the book, which I tell in the present tense, the idea is that the reader comes along with me, meeting everyone, trying to decide as I do. And sometimes we may come to different opinions. I want to introduce you to two of the villagers who are in the book. One is Lottie, who you see here, who was one of the first Jews that I interviewed in the New York area. And here she is in Rexingen, and as a teenager, and she was called Stumpela at the time. And then here she is in Riverdale, where I interviewed her several times with her granddaughter. She had 7 children. And as you can see, no one could call her Stumpela anymore. The other person I'd like you to meet is Max Sire, who is the reason that I decided to revisit the village story in my newly published Good Neighbors, Bad Times Revisited. He wrote me at the age of 88 from South Australia, where he lived, and wanted to thank me for the book that I wrote about memoir. Here he is, you can see, as a young boy, who it turned out grew up 5 houses from where my grandfather had built his house. But his Catholic family moved in a few months after the last of my Jewish family fled the village and Germany, so they were never neighbors. And after some back and forth emails, Max sent me his unpublished memoir, written about 20 years earlier for his family. And so it was very unguarded and private. It wasn't meant for audience. And when I read it, I heard a conversation between memoirs. I'd like to read a little bit from both Lottie and Max, both about Kristallnacht. Seems the right time to do that. And to capture how I heard these memories talking to each other as if out of different windows of history. In revisiting, incidentally, excerpts from Max's memoir are mini chapters in between the memoir that I wrote, my original memoir. So here is Lottie, who, as you will see, has memories both dark and bright. They're very conflicted, and I think that is something I found quite often in people's memories. So Lottie, this is from a section in the book called Joie de Vivre that is all about Lottie and the 3 times that I interviewed her. Lottie talks of how she used to climb up to the meadow on that hill to pick flowers, lie in the sun, and listen to the sounds of the village. It was so wonderful. I hear voices from the village and the sound of the anvil, and the smithy made such a wonderful noise, and that would echo in my ears. The crowing, the mooing of the cows, and the sense of belonging, that this was my place. And then Lottie talks of the Nazi festivities that were held under the swastika that was built on that very same hill. They would congregate under it at night and make a huge fire. You'd hear crowds yelling, torches swaying. It was very frightening to us. And they'd sing Nazi songs and shout anti-Semitic propaganda. Did you know the people who went to the bonfires, I asked? Were they out-of-towners or were they from Rexingen? Some were from Rexingen. There was one, the son of a letter carrier. The father wanted nothing to do with him. Another family nearby was also Nazi, but most of the neighbors were very supportive of the Jews. Everyone said it couldn't last forever. The Nazi government will fall and everything will be like before. She smiles. You can't minimize the illusions that people lived under. The illusions were nurtured, she said, not only by our optimistic neighbors, but also by the fear of starting new somewhere or not having enough money to leave, or of having an old parent who wouldn't be able to get a visa. The illusions lasted until the day after Kristallnacht, she says. Only then did neighbors no longer dare to say hello in public, and children began to throw stones more openly, even though the parents disapproved. And the constant barrage of anti-Semitic propaganda had its effect. When you are pounded with how terrible the Jews are, even I, after a while, began to feel like a bad person. But even in 1939, right before Lottie left on the last boat to leave Germany before the war, her memories of communal decency prevailed over those of random violence. The Rexingeners, you know, were not animals, she insists. That wouldn't go in our village. They didn't beat up anybody or harm anybody. Even if they arrested someone, they were civil. You couldn't just beat up anybody because you felt like beating up. There was a code that was maintained, a code of civility. So, and then I just want to read a little bit from Max, who, even as an 8-year-old, felt the code, that code of civility breaking down. And so this is his memory after Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht brought about a very different way of life, most Christians being ashamed of what happened, the Jews not trusting us anymore. They stayed in their home most of the time, and their business had display signs stating that inside is a Jewish-owned business. The Nazis glued placards on those houses urging Germans don't buy in Jewish businesses, which of course the Jewish owners weren't brave enough to remove. I was always told to treat Jews the same as everybody else, but that estranged feeling stayed with me. I used to feel uneasy when I met Jews on the road. Some of our Jewish neighbors also showed annoyance with us. There weren't many friendly smiles anymore. I suppose they didn't know what they did wrong to be treated like this. The Jews had lived their lives as they were brought up, and that never hurt any of the Christians in the village. Every now and then, one or two Jewish families disappeared. They would go across the Swiss border, then go to Portugal, and from there to America or England. 2 or 3 months later, we heard that they were in London or in America. Further down the street, there lived a couple of girls about my age, and this leaving was their plight. When I heard it, I felt sorry for them, as I knew they couldn't speak English. And I said to Mom, but they can't talk to anyone. Mom said, they can't talk to anybody here either. So I think I'll stop here for now.
Well, thanks very much for that teaser as well, Mimi. And I know that we're going to come back and talk more about what you found in that village of Rexingen. And I think right there, the way you capture Max's counterpoint to what you found from Lottie, I mean, that's what characterizes your book, right? This discussion, and we're going to come back to that. But first, let me ask our third speaker, Ellen Cassedy, to come on and give us a little bit of a taste of your book.
Okay, it's really an honor to be invited to talk with you tonight about my book, We Are Here, Memories of the Lithuanian Holocaust, and also about the journey that led to the book, a journey that changed my view of the past, changed my view of the future, and changed me. So I'm going to share my screen in a second here. Oops. Wait a minute. Hold on. Not working. Okay, hold on. Thorin, can you help me out?
Yeah, we saw it, but I can pull it up on mine.
Oh, try this. Wait, hold this. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so on the cover of my book is my grandfather, Yankel Levin, and he's the one on the left, the cute one. And he came to America from Lithuania in 1911, right around the turn of the 20th century, escaping the Tsar's draft. And this is my Jewish grandfather on my mother's side. And the other side has to do with England, Germany, and Ireland, which is where the name Cassidy comes from. Now, when I decided to go to Lithuania, I basically had no idea where the country was. And I had to get out an atlas to find it. It's the most southern of the 3 Baltic nations with Latvia and Estonia on top. And it's a tiny country, home today to only 4,000 Jews. But what I did know was that Lithuania had a terrible, notorious Holocaust history. I knew that in 1941, the Jews of Lithuania were massacred with a swiftness and thoroughness that was unusual even for that terrible time. I knew that in most cases, it was the German invaders who issued the orders, but in most cases, it was actually Lithuanians who pulled the triggers. And in fact, the killing began before the Germans came in. And by the end of the war, only 6% of Lithuania's 240,000 Jews remained alive. And one of the survivors was my Uncle Will. He's the one on the left, the cute one, and he's my grandfather's brother. And as I prepared to go to Lithuania, he was in his late 80s, and he revealed to me that he had been a member of the Jewish ghetto police in the ghetto where he was confined. And these were Jews who helped to keep order in the ghetto under the Nazi command, a controversial group of people. Now, I was shocked to learn this. And in many ways, my book became a search for the meaning of this revelation. Was my uncle a perpetrator? Was he a collaborator? Was he a victim? Or some of all three? Now, a second old man in the book, sort of the bookend to my uncle, is an old man in my ancestral town who I call Stepanus in the book. And in 1941, as a boy of 17, Stepanus watched as the Jews of the town were assembled in a field and driven into the forest to be shot. And that knowledge had tormented him all his life. And now a town official told me that Stepanus was asking to speak to a Jew before he died. And would I be that Jew? Now, I have to say, I was not eager to be that Jew. I had not been brought up to feel warmly toward such a person who stood by and watched as my people were abused and tormented. And if not for what I had heard from my Uncle Will, I think I might have said no, I might have turned away. But now, in some ways, the ground had shifted and my moral curiosity had been aroused. And so I agreed, yes, I would talk with him. And before I did meet him, I went looking to educate myself about the more than half a century of Lithuanian history, the Nazi era, the Soviet era, and the years since. And I learned by the time that the Soviet Union fell in 1991 and Lithuania became a new independent nation, half a century under two regimes had created a cauldron boiling and bubbling with competing senses of martyrdom, competing senses of victimhood, and seemingly irreconcilable narratives about the past. But within this very difficult environment, some brave people, both Jews and non-Jews, had begun working to build bridges and to create a new public discourse and to engage deeply with the country's Jewish heritage, even when it was painful, and to attempt to build an active civil society in the land that had once been known as the Jerusalem of the North. And I got to know some of these people, and they educated me, they inspired me, and they changed me. Many people I met started to cry when they talked about the Holocaust, because Lithuania has not finished coming to terms with its past. And I think, in fact, that process will never be finished, because only through eternal remembrance and reflection can there be the kind of maturation that's necessary for building a democratic society. Anti-Semitism is alive and well in Lithuania today. I saw swastikas. Right-wing nationalists are present and influential in Lithuanian politics, and the government has struggled with how to respond. Sound familiar? And so I can't tell you whether on balance Lithuania is moving forward or backward when it comes to building a tolerant society, and maybe it's both. And I think both political scientists and psychologists will tell you that zigzagging back and forth between denial and acceptance is typical, both for traumatized individuals and for traumatized societies. And again, I think we can think of our own country in this regard. I do know that many people in Lithuania abhor the neo-Nazi creed as much as all of us do. And they're searching for ways to remember the Jewish past in a respectful way. This picture shows old photos of Jews in Vilnius, which Jews called Vilna, posted by a group involved in coming to terms with the Jewish past. And I think, as for my Uncle Will and for Stepanus, I don't expect ever to stop asking myself, what could they have done? And in the same spirit, what would I have done? What could I have done? And what will I do? And what am I doing? Because during that terrible time in the mid-20th century that we're talking about, solidarity was often difficult, if not impossible. And at that time, as in so many other times, it was so much easier to stand by than to stand up. And I think our job as human beings and as citizens is to reverse that equation, to create the kind of society where you can stand up, where it's not up to each individual to decide, what will I do, to make the terrible life and death decisions alone, where people join together to use the tools of civic engagement and social action and resist the forces of hatred. And I think we can remember and we can do our part to create the kind of societies throughout the world where people can not only stand by, but stand up and speak up throughout the world. So thank you very much. And I look forward to our conversation now.
Well, thanks also, Ellen, for you and that introduction. And I got to say, you speak my language when you talk about standing up rather than being bystanders. That is a key message for my institution, for the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. It's all about trying to promote that idea of being, as we say, an upstander, but also just because we know the damage the bystanders did. And we know all the quotes that people have said about the power of bystanders. And so anyway, good to hear you say it as well. Thank you. I want to bring Mimi and Catherine back on if I can. I want to thank all three of you for those introductory teasers, but I do want to now switch to a more conversation mode and encourage, again, people out there, if you've got questions, please go ahead and send them our way using the Q&A function is probably the easiest. And I know a couple have come in already, but I thought maybe I would just lead us off with one question, and that is just about the title for our panel. You know, the title for our panel today, Returning Home After the Holocaust. And I wondered if I could get the three of you to offer perspectives on the takeaway from your books about that process of returning home. And maybe another way to come at it is, what does home mean in your books? Because I don't think it means always the same thing. I don't know if anybody wants to jump on that first, or if it sounds like something, a topic that's appropriate.
But if I may, you know, after translating this book and seeing how it relates to our modern discourse over immigration, and seeing refugees from other countries come to ours and struggle to fit in and to be accepted, it suddenly occurred to me that Germany became a country where people could return. There's still anti-Semitism in Germany, but it's not coming from the government this time. It's coming from, you know, neo-Nazis, as it were, and it's also coming from other immigrants. But it's not coming from the German government anymore. So they're safe as far as those people, as far as being exiled again. So it was interesting to consider whether or not some of these other countries might become hospitable again for the people who've left and come here, for example, or gone to other countries. And, you know, what sorts of stories might they tell in that future?
Sure. Mimi or Ellen? Oh, just unmute yourself there.
Got it?
Yeah.
So I think for me, the coming home happened at the end of several years of talking to both the Jews who fled and their neighbors in the village. And I think that is why my book is a memoir, is that I really thought I was just doing narrative journalism. And it was because I had avoided this idea that what happened in Germany to my family was connected to my own life here. And that I think that was particularly true as the last 10 years from when I first published my first book, where anti-Semitism has risen, the politics of hate has become increased, the past that I thought I was studying at a distance moved in closer. And so, as a matter of fact, the letter that I got from Max was the same week of the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. So, and I think that was another motivation to somehow have to process and see how these neighbors and their lives connected to my own life in New Jersey, and who are my neighbors? Who am I as a neighbor? And so I think the coming home was the bringing of the past in a more personal sense, as opposed to a history book sense, into my own life as well.
I guess I would say that for me, I went to Vilnius for a summer, and I enrolled in the Vilnius Yiddish Institute, and I studied Yiddish very intensely there. And I think my sense of home or a homeland really came to be centered on the Yiddish language. And as I did all these interviews with people about the Holocaust and really sort of stepped onto this very upsetting and disturbing moral terrain, I would come home at night and immerse myself in these textbooks and these texts and the alphabet. And I felt a real connection with the whole years and years and years of Jewish scholarship, where people just, sank into these holy texts and these books and commentaries. And it was a source of tremendous consolation to me to feel that connection. And so that's really the sense of home that I got from being in Lithuania.
Hmm.
I just have to say, Ellen, when you talk about that Yiddish, when you write about that intensive Yiddish program that you were there, and it's really a central kind of background of your book. First of all, it sounded super intimidating. And then secondly, it was amazing. You said something clicked and you started understanding much more of that Yiddish, and it just kind of got to you at some point. So it was revealing. I know that's not about home, but it was just such a nice part about your book. I want to go, if I may, to something, Mimi, you just mentioned, and about something I think actually that about the people you met. And I'm
Sure.
wondering about, I just want to read a quote that where is this? I'm just finding. There's something, I can't remember where it was, but one of you writes about several times about whether you can trust the stories you're hearing. And in this case, the story, or in your case, Catherine, the stories that you're translating, can you trust them for a view of history? Or is it the archival material and other sources that we have to go to? And are the audio, the oral histories, are they flawed? And I think this is something that you all deal with. I wonder if you could speak about it.
Well,
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead, maybe.
Well, I found that truth was collective in the sense that each person told their story, and you begin to hear patterns that get repeated. There are the stories that everybody tells. There are the stories that run counter to the traditional stories that you hear. And so the structure of my book is to keep entering into these different houses and hearing the story. And because it's in the present tense, my mind is constantly trying to process, what do I believe? That's part, I think, how do we know what we're hearing? But when you hear 15 different stories that focused on the same village and what happened, you begin to get a sense of what it was. Now, I have to say that in the first book, I was only interested in good neighbors. So I wasn't interested, I had a group of people and I was getting their stories. Max, when he entered the scene and wrote me, he was never mentioned, his family was never mentioned as one of the good neighbors. So then there was another processing, and he just came out of the blue. No one had mentioned him. And he was a child at the time, right? But no one had mentioned his parents. His parents hadn't stayed in touch with any one of the Jews, either in Israel or in the United States, as had many of the first group. So it was again this, how do you know? How do you believe? Which the irony is, we spent 2 years, this family and I, back and forth. And in the end, we had built up a trust that of cooperation that did not require forgiving or forgetting or even knowing what exactly the story was. And I think that was the biggest lesson that I took away, because we're at that point now. We may never agree on things, but what I found in doing this second book is that you can work together and create a sense of neighbor just by being positive and civil, going back to the civil code, that makes you willing and able to work with other people who you may see as other in many other ways. So
I think that sounds a lot like what I also hear in your book, Ellen. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, just to speak to the question of what is true and, and can we trust these things? When I was doing my research for this book and meeting people, and, my book takes you into these, lunches with people and interviews, and, there's a whole swirl of different viewpoints and different kinds of memories. And I think you can never really establish, is this absolutely true? But you weave for yourself a kind of tapestry of what it means for you. And you weave into that, well, this person said this, and which is directly contradicted by what this other person said. And I think that's all part of being a writer and being a reader and being a citizen. And I think that the words of witnesses and people who live through things are an extremely important part of history. And I would never want to rely only on the written documents. Those too are, there are plenty of lies can be written down in a document too. So I think it's all a sifting process that is completely fascinating to me.
And Kathryn, your book is all about these testimonies or these statements by these people who've returned to Germany. What do you take from them? I feel like you got to know them. You must have gotten to know them in the process of translating them.
Well, I feel like I got to know their voices.
Yeah.
This was, I'll say that this book was documented, these stories were documented by a German journalist, Andrea von Treuenfeld, who herself is not Jewish, but after meeting some women who had returned to Germany after their experiences in other countries and their difficulties, she really felt compelled to tell their stories. And she still feels compelled to continue the stories, and has a book out now in Germany where she interviews the grandchildren of many of the people that she's interviewed in the past. What I wanted to say about truth is that I think the other authors, including Andrea von Treuenfeld, there's a different responsibility that they might carry as writers and researchers. There's a very well-documented history of what happened during World War II and what the Germans did and what the Nazis did. And so for me, translating oral histories, truth is really not something that I need to question. I am concerned with the brief of the author. She documented these stories in as close to their own words as she possibly could. And so that was an important element that she wanted to bring across, was that everything was in the words of the women who spoke these stories. And so this isn't really a question about whether or not a particular fact is true, but rather what it was that they experienced and what they remember about those experiences. And I think that's a different perspective of history than, finding out that, yes, 100 people out of 300 people had the same experience, therefore it occurred.
But you're not just the translator, right? You are also the publisher who decided that this book is one that you want to share in English. And so I assume that you said, these stories, I believe them. I believe that these people are telling, what they felt. And I feel that this is a story that needs to be shared, or these 16 stories are worthy of being shared.
Yes, absolutely. And what was interesting about their experiences, which again, I didn't feel like I needed to question the veracity of it, because it was such a personal experience, was how they're moving from Germany, how they're being forced to flee, or their parents taking them with them, how that affected their Jewish identity and their national identity and their ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. all of those things changed for these women. I mean, they couldn't study what they wanted to study, so they couldn't then identify as the teachers they had wanted to be or the lawyers. One was fortunate enough to study medicine as she had wanted to. And so that worked out for her. But a lot of the other women, their identities really shifted as a result. And this wasn't necessarily a decision that they had come to on their own. This was a decision that was forced upon them.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you were going to go there when I asked about home, because one of the things that's notable, I think, in yours is the 16 different people they come up with different statements at the end where they say, I am German, or I am Argentinian, or I am American, or I am Israeli, and they really do, and you share this, how they define themselves.
Right.
I want to get to some of the questions that are coming in, but there's one more that I want to pose to all of three of you from me, and that's just wondering about the links you see between your three books. And I'm wondering if there are aspects of your work that become clearer by talking about them in comparison or in relation with the other people's books on this program. I wonder if you have thoughts about that, the links.
Well, I responded to Ellen talking about the weaving of the past. I mean, I have the feeling that maybe all of us, that in doing this, the complexity of the past. And one of the things I love about the small stories, and I think we've all written stories of individuals, is that they both affirm and run counter to the stories you find in history books. They're much more nuanced, they're much more complex, and the more voices you can juxtapose next to each other, the richer the history or the understanding of history becomes. And I think that seems to me, I hear as a thread in all of our work.
That microscope that you can apply to that time in history and really kind of draw in on something much, much smaller than the large picture. You can see a much smaller picture. And I think we're all, shining a light on individual pixels within that larger picture.
Yeah,
Nicely
I think
said.
all three books give you kind of an intimate perch from which to observe some great sweep of history, the macro forces. And I think that's so important. I also think that, I grew up with the narrative of the Holocaust, in which there were good people and there were bad people. And in a way, that kind of thinking is what leads to the tribalism and leads to genocides. And I think what I discovered in my journey, and what you two also did, is that sort of separating people into, okay, you over here, you're bad, you over here, you're good, that we complicate it, as somebody said this evening, we complicate that story. And some people fall in between. And the fact that Mimi, having done all her research, then 10 years later, she finds somebody else who was not even in that group called the good people, but had good feelings and was a decent person. And I think that's a very important discovery.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I have to admit, I look at your three works, I see kind of Catherine looking at how 16 individuals processed and came to terms with the Holocaust about 50 years later. I see then that Mimi is looking not at individuals, but at how a town went through that process. And then how Ellen is looking at how a nation is going through that process as well. Obviously, it's much more than that. You're doing other things. You're weaving various narratives together, but there's a kind of similarity in that about how people are processing the Holocaust many years later.
That's a very nice way of looking at it too.
Let me just pose I was surprised when I read this question or this statement. So somebody writes in, a woman named Andrea Detling. She says, I'm the local archivist in Rexingen.
Oh, yeah.
And currently I'm writing a book about the history of Rexingen. And the chapter about the National Socialism is really a challenge, she says. There's no people anymore who can tell about that time. But there are a lot of documents about interviews with former Jewish citizens, also interviews during the process in front of the court. So it's just, first of all, it's just the way our world is now with virtual programming, that we can have somebody joining us from Rexingen. And but what she's talking about is how you guys were able to speak to people, and we know this is a Holocaust memorial, that the individuals who lived through the Holocaust, that they're, whether perpetrators, bystanders, or victims, or families of, or survivors, we know that there's fewer and fewer of them around, and their oral histories, the ones that you took or that you shared, are becoming a harder and harder commodity to find and to find. So very important that you did it.
Right. Well, I think I felt like I arrived just exactly at the right time. If I had come 10 years early when people were in their 60s and younger, no, they wouldn't have spoken. If I arrived 10 years later when people are in their 80s and 90s, their memories wouldn't be as good. But just there was this point, I don't know if the rest of you found it, where in the early 70s or so, where you really wanted to confront the past and were willing to talk.
Let me get to some of the questions that have come in. Somebody wrote, Greta Kraus wrote, for people who had courage to think for themselves and to try to do what's right and help others, what do you think gave them that courage? And I know Catheryn's book doesn't really talk about the perpetrators, but I think Ellen and Mimi, both of you deal with people who did try to do the right thing at times. So what gave them that courage?
What they would tell me is they were just being human. That was a phrase that surprisingly came up again and again. The people in the village, they did not save. They didn't hide anybody. It was a tiny village. They didn't stop Jews from being deported. And, a third of the village did perish in the Holocaust, but they did what they could to help. They weren't super brave. They would bring soup at night to a Jewish woman who couldn't get a visa to get out. They would come and clean the house. They would share their ration cards. They would fix the Jewish shoes when you weren't allowed to, this kind of thing. But there was a group of 3 who were half Jewish in the village who said without 10 or 12 families, they would not have survived. They took care of them. They were little girls when their mother was sick. But just think if it had been 80% of the village, you couldn't have had a Hitler. So it's a shame that there was, what you were talking about, the upstanders. They were enough to create a code of civility in this village, but not enough that one village cannot fight the whole machine. But if all over, you have 80% of the people doing things like bringing soup at night to the quote enemy, that makes a difference, I think.
Yeah, that was something that I learned also, was that there were many, many tiny little acts of courage and compassion. There's the righteous, who are formally recognized by the state of Israel as rescuers and people who took risks to help Jews. But in addition to those people, those documented people, there were so many other people who just did a little something here and there. In fact, after I published my book, I heard from someone, got in touch with me, and she said, I figured out from your book and your description of your uncle and his family that my family helped them, and they helped to hide your uncle, and they helped your cousin when she was a young girl living in the ghetto. They gave her a job and fed her and gave her bread and jam. And so there were these little things that people were able to do. And again, just like you, Mimi, people said, well, of course I did that. How could I not have? So you're sort of like trying to figure out like what was special about these people. In many ways, they were typical human beings. And there was some kind of support that they got from the people around them that enabled them to take that step and to consider what they did to be normal and typical. And that's what I think we have to find and support in our own society.
Greta also asks about, and this is somewhat a counterfactual question, but what do you think people living during that period could have done more to do to help the Jews that were around them? What could they have done? And I think you've hinted at it somewhat, maybe by talking about, you know, if only a third or 50 or 40% do something versus 80, but could more, what more could have been done by these folks in Rexagen or in Lithuania, or for the people that you talk about, Catherine?
Gosh. One thing that I come back to over and over again when I think about what more could have been done is more people could have been taken in. You know, there's a story that one of our women tells that her sister was on the boat that was turned away by the United States. There were some 200 plus people on it, and they were sent back to Europe, and some of them were eventually sent to camps. And there they thought, you know, here was our opportunity to get away from this, and no, their hopes were dashed. I think the whole world could have done a better job of protecting some of these people from being killed by their own government.
For sure, for sure.
When I was doing this, what struck me was how slow, I mean, you know, the Nazi movement tightened more and more from the end of the 20s to the total takeover of society. And I felt as if only people had done more in 1934, 1935, before once the Nazis really took over, it was very hard for an individual who was not super brave to risk doing a lot. And so I felt, and I think a lot of people I know who have a legacy from the 1930s Germany, that we need you know, we're going through some of that now. We need, you know, all the stories of standing up for democracy and making sure that we act now is connected to that feeling like I've either studied this or I've lived through it, and I know that there are turning points. So that was one of my takeaways when I was doing the research for the book.
Hear, hear. Well put.
Well, that leads actually to, we need to start wrapping up, but I want to wrap up perhaps with something that, Catherine, you write in your introductory note, where you say the current climate of anti-Semitism in the United States should compel us to continue sharing as many stories as possible with newer generations so that humanity may never forget what happened. And I wonder to what degree events in America today shape the reason for your books or for the message that you want people to take away from them.
Such a great question. I'm so glad you asked. You know, I hate to bring politics into my work, but because, you know, I'm pretty much, you know, a diehard liberal here. But, you know, I think maybe that bias, I couldn't tell at the time if I was reading into things that weren't there, reading more into some of the news items that were coming out after, you know, I translated this book in 2016 when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were both running for president. And the RNC, as some of you may remember, was in Cleveland that summer. And one piece of news that came out that caught my eye immediately, because I had just finished translating the section on the Nazi actions, was that Chris Christie was talking about finding ways to fire civil servants that weren't loyal to the the coming administration, which we didn't know was going to be elected. But if they got in, that was going to be one of the first things they did. And by the way, it was one of the first things the Nazis did. And so when I saw there was a think piece on that very notion, Chris Christie just proposed the very same thing that the Nazis did. And it was really hard not to feel a little bit hysterical over it, I have to say. There were other incidents too, but that summer with all the news that kept coming out and the memes of some, a Nazi person turning on the gas in an oven. I mean, these were supporters of Trump. It was really hard not to feel a little bit of hysterical anxiety over it.
Mimi or Ellen, what about you for contemporary resonances?
Yeah, I mean, Ann Appleby has been on a lot of programs lately with the idea that you can't battle with other or with people who disagree with you, that you have to find some common ground that you can build on. And that resonated so much with me with this new revisiting of the book, where I really felt, yes, that is the way forward. Let's try to find as many things as we can that doesn't demonize the other side, or don't worry about it, and do something. Yeah, we both want to clear up this stream, or we both want to have national service. This seems to be very popular, where everybody comes in and meets each other and works on things together. And I feel as if unless we can find ways to stop demonizing each other and listen and find a way not to convince the other person, but to find things that you want to do together, that we are going to continue to have a very tough time and move towards battling in a way that we want to avoid, if we want to avoid not the authoritarian world.
That we need to link arms and move forward together in pursuit of common goals.
Yeah, so even if you disagree on 90%, if you can find 10% that you can work on, it's a start. I think that actually it's like marriage, right? If you argue about money and you argue about these big things, you don't get anywhere. But if you say, if you stop putting your shoes in the bathroom that I trip over, and the person actually does it, you've made a step forward. So low-hanging fruit.
I was struck, particularly in Mimi and Ellen's books, about, there were times you say you bristle at some person's statement, and yet I see over the course, by the end of the book, you're less bristly and you're trying to find that common ground, and I really do see it in those books. So I see that message coming out. There are many more questions, but we have run out of time. What I would like to suggest, and I hope this is okay, I'm going to share these questions with the three of you offline and ask you perhaps if you're willing to send a couple of emails responding to some of these inquiries, just to follow up.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
But
what a pleasure
thank
to be with
all
you.
three of you for joining us and for sharing a little bit about your book. And for you out there who are watching, I encourage you to find these books, these three books. We Are Here. Oops, there's one of them. Good Neighbor, Bad Times Revisited, and Going Back. All super reads and really lead us down some interesting pathways. So thank you for watching, and thank you for joining us. And I look forward to seeing all of you at other programs again soon. And thank you again to our three panelists.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Have a good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.